from Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 through 22. I'm going to read from the English Standard Version, and it reads like this. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now, this was the custom in the former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal, and then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion, and all that belonged to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life, a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. And Obed followed Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. This is the word of God for the people of God, and we say thanks be to God. I would like to title our sermon from this text on this morning, "In the Hands of a Master." In the hands of a master. Help me, Father. I'll never forget the day. It was Wednesday, November the 14th, 2012. It was on that day that the great movie buff, my friend and brother, Minister Drew, and I decided to meet up at the Regal Movie Theaters in Silver Spring, Maryland, to see the new James Bond movie, Skyfall, that had just come out that previous Friday. But not too long after the movie started, I saw my phone ringing and buzzing, and it was a call from my oldest son's school. Mason, he was just 4 at the time, and the school was calling. And so I was hoping that it wasn't an emergency, but just in case, I stepped out of the movie theater and answered the phone call. And sure enough, it was a big emergency. The school had called to tell me that while climbing the steps of a slide, Mason had slipped and fell and literally had split his forehead open, wide open. On one of the steps on the slide, it hit right there and split it wide open. And they wanted to know how close by I was because they had already called the ambulance and they were getting ready to rush him to the hospital. So naturally, of course, I'm very concerned. Minister Drew and I, we rushed out of the movie theater. And fortunately, we were just 5 minutes away, so we got there less than 5 minutes before the ambulance even got there. But without getting into gruesome detail, because I know y'all don't want to hear about all of that, when I arrived, I did not expect to see what I saw. After seeing how bad the gash was on his forehead, the only thing that kept my reaction in check was I didn't want to get Mason alarmed because I really wanted to cry when I saw the wound. So we immediately rushed him to the hospital, seeing that it was clear that he would need stitches. And I was even thinking that he possibly needed to get staples. It was that bad. At this point, Lady Key met us at the hospital, arrived at the hospital around the same time. And when we finally saw the attending doctor, started telling us about the procedure, what was happening, how they would have to clean out the wound, they would have to give him a shot to numb the area, so they began stitching up the wound. And she said that she was going to let the doctor who was on residency, still learning how to be a doctor, stitch up Mason's wound. So I was already a bit on edge as it was. And then hearing that the doctor was going to let the doctor who is still learning how to be a doctor stitch up Mason's wound, that was quite unnerving for me. And so the attending doctor left the room, and as the doctor in residency started working to stitch up the wound, I began to get even more uneasy because her hands started shaking. I saw her start sweating, and then she kept fidgeting around and kept moving. She was like she was trying to get a better angle to start the stitching. And as she continued to struggle, and I saw her hands shaking, my uneasiness quickly rose to the level of not just concern, but worry. And in that moment, I had a decision to make. Was I going to keep my son in the hands of this doctor in residency who is still learning, or ask for the hands of someone who was more experienced and more capable? Ultimately, I decided that it was too much at risk by keeping him in the hands of that doctor in residency. God bless her heart. She just wasn't cut out for it. She didn't have enough experience. She was not capable of the job. So as politely as I could, I let her know that I wasn't comfortable with her stitching up my son's forehead and that I needed someone with more experience to attend to my son's wound. With almost a look of relief on her face, she consented and quickly left the room to find the attending doctor. And eventually she and the attending doctor came back in the room, and the attending doctor began to work almost in a masterful way. She was able to explain to us that the wound was so deep that in a sense she had to stitch it in the inside, but then also stitch it on the outside to make sure that the wound would close and it would not reopen later. And so what she had to do was really in detail. It was because she had experience that she knew what to do. And she said, not only will it make sure that the wound does not reopen, but it will reduce the amount of scarring. And she said that because of this, when he gets older, you probably won't even be able to see the scar that much. And that was what is the case today. You can barely notice it unless you know what happened. That was a nerve-wracking and uncomfortable moment for me. Having to tell a doctor, I'm not comfortable with you working on my son. I need someone whose hands are more capable, someone who has more experience. I need to have my son in the hands of someone who knows what they are doing. But I knew it was so much on the line that I needed my son in capable hands. I needed my son in the hands of a master. in order to repair the damage and so that the scar would just be minimum, I had to make the decision to make sure my son was in the hands of a master. You know, whose hands something is in makes a difference. It is said that a basketball in my hands is worth about $19. But you put that same basketball in the hands of LeBron James and it is worth $38 million. You put a baseball in my hand and it's maybe worth $6. But if you put that same baseball in the hands of Max Scherzer, the starting pitcher for the Washington Nationals, it's worth $15 million. A tennis racket in my hand, as much as I love to play tennis, it's not worth much at all. It's rather useless in my hands. But you put that same tennis racket in Serena Williams' hands, and it is worth 23 Grand Slam championships. A rod in my hand, perhaps I'll be able to keep wild animals away, but a rod in Moses' hands will part the Red Sea. A slingshot in my hand is just a kid's toy, but a slingshot in David's hand was a mighty weapon. 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread in my hand is a couple of pieces of fish sandwiches. But 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread in God's hands will feed thousands. It's all about whose hands it's in. Because nails in my hands might get you a picture hung on the wall, but nails in Jesus' hands will produce the salvation and redemption of the entire world. See, it all depends on whose hands it's in. And as we've been going through this book of Ruth, it ought to be clear by now that God's hand of providence, while seemingly hidden at times, has been behind each and every move, every part that has been orchestrating as God has been hooking up Boaz and Ruth. These 2 upstanding, honorable, worthy folks of noble character. And he's been hooking them up. And now when we pick back up here in the story in chapter 4, it seems as if things have been left hanging in the balance at the end of chapter 3. After being led by the honest intentions of her mother-in-law, Naomi, Ruth has approached Boaz at night, and she's asked Boaz to redeem her. In essence, to do for her what he was supposed to do as a kinsman redeemer, to marry her and to take care of her. And it seems like everything has gone to plan. Boaz does not take advantage of her. He says to her, what you have done has been more kind than what you did to your mother-in-law. And it seems like everything is going on as planned. But Boaz says to her, actually, there's another one who's a closer kinsman redeemer than I am. Boaz had to go and get all technical. Right when we thought that they would get married and live happily ever after, Boaz says there's another kinsman redeemer who is closer to you and who has the first right of refusal. And as we transition from chapter 3 to chapter 4, we're left to wonder what will come of this situation. It's like me in the hospital room when I saw that resident fumbling around on my son's head. It's actually not unlike those moments we all face in life where we're facing that crossroad where it's unclear about what the outcome is going to be. And in those moments we're all faced with, they are defining moments. The decisions that we make in those moments are so defining. Because the question really is, in whose hands are we going to put that situation into? And in those moments, we're all tempted. We're all tempted to take matters into our own hands. We mentioned it last week, but Ruth could have gotten discouraged and said to herself, I know I shouldn't have listened to Naomi. Why did I listen to her and go and meet this man Boaz? And I knew I shouldn't. Matter of fact, I don't even know why I think that she thought that she was a trusted advisor. I should have left her like Orpah did and gone back to my family in Moab. I should have turned back around. I can imagine Ruth saying to herself, Boaz, why didn't you just go ahead and marry me? Why are you being a prude? Why are you following customs like this? Come on, we could just go get hitched up and nobody have to know. Why can't you just take me on as your wife right now? We ain't got to go through all those hoops. Why we got to jump through all those hoops? We can just get married and go on and be fine in life. She also could have said, I don't even know this other kinsman redeemer. I ain't ever seen this joker. For all I know, he might be a bozo instead of a Boaz. She could have said to herself, matter of fact, I'm not trying to mess around with that bozo. I'm just going to go into town and find myself a rich young man to get married to. I know how to work what I got, and I can get this man, I can get a rich young man to marry me. That would have been Ruth being ruthless. I can only imagine how uneasy and frustrated she must have felt after Boaz said, yes, but there's another one who might be closer. She didn't even know this dude. Boaz had to get all buttoned up on her when he could have just cut a little corner. And can you imagine what Boaz was probably tempted to do? He was probably tempted to cut the corner. He was probably tempted to say, I could just circumvent the cultural customs of our day. Matter of fact, like I told you last week, Boaz was living during time. This was happening during time where at Judges chapter 21, verse 25, it says that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And so everybody else is going for self. I'm just going to go for self. That's what Boaz could have done. He could have done what was right in his own eyes. Why do I have to do things the right way all the time? Why can't I be like everybody else and do things my way? What will bring me happiness? What will bring me pleasure? What will bring me more money? Why do I have to be forced to do things the right way? In a time when everyone else was out for self, why can't I just do what makes me happy? Truth is, we're all faced with those moments when we have to decide whose hands are we going to leave the matter in? But what our passage this morning should encourage us is that when things are looking shaky, when things are looking uneasy, when things don't look quite right, and we don't know what the outcome is going to be, that in those moments, we need to put that matter in the hands of the master. God has master hands. And in his hands, we can be confident that they will always work out for our good and his glory. In his hands, we can be confident that no matter what the situation is, God will work it out for our good and his glory. I know you want to fix it yourself. I know you think it won't hurt if you cut corners. I know you think I can just do it my way and it'll be fine. I know you don't want to have to wait on the Lord. I know you want to do it your way. But your hands, my hands, our hands, they are inexperienced and they are incapable of doing a good job at stitching up things in our life. But there is one whose hands are master hands. His hands can redeem what has been taken. It can restore what has been lost. And it can revive what is dead. Whew! I want to say it again for somebody to encourage you. God's hands can redeem what has been taken. It can restore what has been lost. And it can revive what has been dead. In our passage this morning, we're encouraged to take our trembling hands off of a situation and put it in the hands of the master. And in these three movements in chapter 4, we see God's masterful hands at work, working in almost a fashion of creating something handmade with his hands. And he is putting the final touches on this beautiful story. And he's bringing all of the different pieces together, the last details. He's threading them together in a beautiful masterpiece. And in this last chapter, that's what we see God doing. He is tying together all of the loose ends, and he's bringing them all together, all the different themes that have been woven throughout this entire narrative, and he is bringing them together in this last chapter. And in these three movements, that's what we see. But particularly, it is the theme of redemption that we see in these last three movements in this fourth chapter. And this is punctuated as Boaz in verses 1 through 13 is seen as a responsible redeemer. If you're taking notes, take notes and write down Boaz is seen as a responsible redeemer in verses 1 through 13. I want you to notice how Boaz, as a responsible redeemer, he takes the initiative responsibly. Boaz, as a responsible redeemer, the first thing that he does is he takes the initiative responsibly. Listen to verse number 1. It says, "Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. And Boaz said to him, 'Turn aside, my friend, sit down here.' And he turned aside and sat down. And then he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, 'Sit down here.' So they sat down. And then he said to the Redeemer, he laid out what was happening. Here it is. Boaz takes the initiative by going to the gate. He goes to the place which would have been the place where he would be able to hold court in order to settle this matter about who would redeem Naomi and Ruth. And what happens is where it says in verse number 1, now Boaz had gone up to the gate. It's almost as if he does not sleep that night. He immediately goes to the gate because he is not going to rest until this matter is settled. And he goes to the place where he knows this is where it will be settled. And as God would have it, after Boaz takes the initiative and goes to the place where he knows the matter will be settled, as God was having it, as he was sitting at the gate, God allowed the Redeemer, who was first of kin, to just come strolling by. That was not coincidence. That was not happenstance. That was not chance. That wasn't an accident. That was God allowing their paths to cross at the right time. We know it because the passage says, behold. It is helping us draw attention to the timing of their paths crossing here at the gate. And Boaz, as a responsible redeemer, who takes initiative responsibly, he gets the Redeemer to sit down. He's like, listen, dude, I don't know where you're going, but you got to sit down. We have something that we got to settle today. That's what a responsible Redeemer does, who takes the initiative, says, listen, I'm going to go to where I need to go. I'm going to make sure that everything is lined up in place, and I'm going to make sure that I get the right people in the right seat. And that's what he does. After he gets the other Redeemer in the right seat, he then goes and he gets 10 witnesses to sit down. Because what he is trying to do is he's getting these 10 witnesses to sit down so they can be witness and attest to the fact that the agreement that Boaz and this other Redeemer made is actually final and secure. He takes the initiative. He further takes the initiative responsibly by stating the matter plainly so that the matter can be settled in the correct and right way. Hear me, folks. Boaz is not reluctant. He is not passive. He doesn't just stay at home and hope things will work out in his favor and just stay lazy at home, acting apathetic, and just sitting around watching TV, playing video games all day. No. Boaz takes the initiative responsibly to do what he knows he needs to do in order to be a redeemer for Ruth. He takes the initiative responsibly. In fact, what we see is that not only does Boaz take the initiative responsibly, but we also see his intent is done in a responsible way as well. He says in verse number 3, he says to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belongs to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I'd tell you and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders, my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you won't redeem it, please let me know. For there's no one besides you who can redeem it, and I come after you. He basically saying, listen, I will be willing to redeem it if you don't redeem it. And everybody, as we're watching this movie, we are thinking and hoping that the Redeemer is going to say, nah, you can take that. But unfortunately, the Redeemer says, I will redeem it. He's taking the initiative. His intent is done in a responsible way. He is laying out everything so that the matter is settled in the right way. And then he says, after the Redeemer says, I'll redeem it, Boaz said to him, now, wait a second. The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you will also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. And then the Redeemer said, nah, homie, I can't redeem that. That's too much for me. That's too pricey for my blood, lest I impair my own inheritance. Literally, the idea here is that he can't afford to do all that redeeming. He says, take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now listen, y'all, if we was watching this in the movie theater right now, we would be clapping and screaming like, yeah, Boaz is going to get her woman. But here it is. Don't miss it. Boaz's intent is done responsibly. By that, I mean that Boaz wasn't trying to circumvent the cultural customs, but he was intent on doing things the right way. He wasn't going to do things in a way that was just comfortable for him. He wasn't going to do things in a way that were not honorable. He wasn't going to settle and do things irresponsibly, but it was clear he intended to be responsible in how he handled the situation. But we also see not only is he responsible in the fact that he takes the initiative and in the fact of his intentions, but he has also encouraged the responsibility of redemption. That's what we also see him do. Because verse number 7 says, now this was the custom in the former times, Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. He has to give him his sandal, basically. And so he gives him his sandal. Then he says to the people, the witnesses in verse number 9, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion, and all that belonged to Mahlon, and also Ruth the Moabite to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among the brothers. Verse 11, then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. Here it is that Boaz decides to incur the responsibility of redemption. And we already know that it was pricey to incur this responsibility. But Boaz, even though it was expensive, even though it was pricey, he was willing to risk the financial loss in order to incur the responsibility of redeeming Ruth. I just wish we had more people who would take on the responsibility to helping others, even if it costs you something. To step in where there is a need and not back away and say, I don't have time, I don't have enough money, I don't have enough energy for that. But if there is a need, to be willing to step in and to incur the responsibility. I think about in our own church family, I found out just by whim that there is a family in our church who has decided to come alongside of a single mother, and they take the single mother's child and let them hang out with their family and let them hang out over their house and take them to the movies with them and when they go out to different events. And that is what that idea here is, incurring the responsibility. It is sharing the burdens of one another. How beautiful is that? But we live in a society where more people are trying to get rid of responsibility than to incur responsibility. I need to pause here and highlight how Boaz goes about redeeming Ruth is responsibly remarkable. What Boaz does, the way that he goes about redeeming Ruth, it is so responsible that it is remarkable. While the point of this story isn't about single women figuring out how to get their Boaz, please don't be mistaken that you think that that's what this story is about. That's not what it's about, but it is some application, and there is some stuff in here worth mentioning that Boaz does here. He goes about things the responsible way, and it is remarkable and exemplary. As I was preparing this week, God had heavy on my heart singles in our congregation, particularly single women. And again, this isn't the point of this passage, but it is a good application point. And single ladies, this is the type of man that you want for yourself. You want someone who takes the initiative responsibly, whose intentions are responsible, and who is willing to encourage responsibility for you and yours. You want a man who is willing to sacrifice and risk finances in order to be with you. You want a man who does things the right way. You want a man who takes the initiative and is not apathetic and just sits back and is lazy and wants everything to come to him. Jerome Gay, in his book that he wrote on the book of Ruth, he says that we live in a culture where men want to marry women that are mothers, but not marry women so they can be committed to them. They want mothers who will take care of them, and they don't want to be committed to a woman to take care of them. That's so sad. And single ladies, I want to encourage you. Perhaps you're dating a man and he doesn't come to church. Allow him to listen to the next 2 minutes. Because what we see in Boaz here is something that single men should aspire to, that all men should aspire to, but particularly single men. You want a man, men, you want to be a man who takes the initiative responsibly. You take the initiative to be responsible and to do things the right way. Your intentions need to be responsible, that you want to go and think about things the right way, that you don't want to cut corners, you don't want to just do what everybody else wants to do, but you want to make sure that you do things the right way. And you want to be a man. You want to be a man who is willing to incur the responsibility of taking care of a family. Listen, y'all. What we see here in Boaz is awe-inspiring. It is remarkable. It is exemplary. But we need to know this, that ultimately Boaz points us to a true and better Boaz, namely Jesus Christ. Because even though Boaz could redeem them so they would live on this life, on this earth happily, Jesus redeems us so that we can live eternally with him. This life here on earth is soon going to end, but one day Jesus is coming back and we will be able to live with him eternally. Boaz points us to Jesus, Jesus who will redeem us with the costly sacrifice of his own shed blood. That our sins would be washed and covered, and that we would not receive the wrath of God because of our sinfulness. Jesus is the true and better Boaz. Hebrews 9:12 tells us this, that Jesus entered once for all into the holy places. He goes and takes on full responsibility and does things the right way, not by the means of blood of goats and calves, but by the means of his own blood. Hear this, thus securing for us an eternal redemption. This passage, even as we see Boaz here being a responsible redeemer, it points us to Jesus Christ, who is the ultimate responsible redeemer. And I don't know about you, but I am glad that I have been redeemed. I have been bought with a price. Jesus has changed my whole life. And if anybody asks you just who I am, tell them I am redeemed. I'm running out of time, but before I go to the second movement of this text, I got to just show y'all that in verse 11, it says, all the people who were at the gate and the elders who were the witnesses, they say, we are witnesses. And may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah. May the Lord act worthily in Ephrath and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez. Here it is that they come in as witnesses, but they leave out as prophets. And this is a word to us. Is that we need to be reminded that we should be encouraging words of life and blessing on others. You never know what word you speak over somebody's life will come to pass in their life. Power of life and death is in the tongue. Therefore, we need to be reminded of Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29. Do not allow any corrupting talk to come out of our mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as it fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. What they prayed, what they said, may the Lord bless you, those things ended up coming to be in Boaz's life. And you never know how God might be using your words to speak prophecy over somebody's life, to give them life. But I got to move on to the second movement. God further ties things together in a handmade type of way in the second movement as we see this theme of redeeming still going through. And what we see is that in the second movement, the restoring redeemer is punctuated. This passage is marked by bitterness to Naomi on the front end, but then it is marked by blessedness to Naomi on the back end. You remember how chapter 1 ends? Chapter 1 ends in verse number 20 where the women said to Naomi, this is Naomi, she's returned back. And she said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. She is bitter when she gets back to Bethlehem. And she says, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. But even though it's marked by bitterness on the front end, it's marked by blessedness on the back end. Because look at chapter 4, verse 14. Then the women said to Naomi, I need to read verse 13. Boaz took Ruth, he became his wife, and went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. Listen, y'all, she came back bitter, but then as a result of God giving life through her daughter-in-law, Ruth, they now burst out in praise of blessedness to God. The same God that Naomi had said, his hand was against me. It's now the same God whose hand is working for her. And all along, when she thought his hand was working against her and his hand was opposing her, it was not opposing her. It was actually working in her favor. The grief experienced by Naomi that prompts her to call herself bitter and to exclaim that God's hand had gone out against her. She also says that God had dealt bitterly with her and that he had brought calamity upon her and that he had returned her empty. That same God is now being blessed and praised because, in fact, his hand was at work providentially in her life. She says she had returned empty. But yet, it says in the passage that she now was not left without a redeemer. She's not empty. She actually has a redeemer. And they say, may his name be renowned in Israel. She has a redeemer to restore her now. And then it goes on to say, not only was she not empty because she has a redeemer, but in verse number 15 it says, and he shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. She thought she was empty, but God was working behind the scenes, stitching things up in order to allow her to have a redeemer in her life who would restore her. It wasn't empty because not only would he give her a redeemer and a restorer, but he would also be a nourisher of her old age. And then it says, for your daughter-in-law who loves you is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Y'all, it's amazing when you think about the context of this passage, that in this culture, that they would say that a daughter who loves you is more than 7 sons. In that culture, that was crazy because sons were always revered more than women. But it says that your daughter-in-law who loves you, she is worth more to you than 7 sons. And here's the thing is that many of us, when we get in our bleak moments where we think that God has had his hand opposed to us, God is actually working behind the scenes, stitching things up in our favor. And he will bless us through the person that we had no idea would be able to bless us. her daughter-in-law would be the source of blessing in her life? Somebody who is listening, perhaps you need to look at that daughter-in-law you have in your life or that son-in-law that you have in your life, and what might God be doing through them for you? It can come through people that you don't expect. It can come through ways that you don't expect. It can come from places that you had no idea that it could come from. And that's what we see here in this third movement, is that God is a redeeming, restoring God. He restores Naomi's story. He brings her life and gives her nourishment even in her old age. The Lord allowed Ruth to conceive. And what we understand is that when it says in verse number 13 that the Lord gave her conception, is that it was a miracle that she got pregnant. I can say this with confidence because if you remember, Naomi, when she was in Moab with her two sons, they got married to the Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, and they were married to them for 10 years and did not have any children. Now listen, back in that day, as soon as you got married, you had to start popping out babies. And so for her not to have had babies for 10 years indicated that she was barren. But now, through the miracle of life, it says that your daughter-in-law who loves you has given birth to this son. Y'all, the good news for us is that same too, we have a Redeemer who has been born miraculously through the virgin birth of Mary. For unto us a child is born. I know it's not Christmas time yet, but y'all need to get happy right there because that's what happens to us through Jesus Christ. We have a restoring Redeemer. You can't tell me that God can't turn things around. You can't tell me God isn't able to turn your mourning into dancing. You can't tell me that God is not able to restore what has been lost. So often we focus on the loss, but we need to focus more on what God has in store. God is able to do exceedingly and abundantly above all that you can ask, think, or imagine. You have limited to God to what you have lost when you're not imagining about what God can give you through restoration, through a Redeemer. Jesus is our restorer of life. He is our Redeemer. And that means that no matter how broken, hopeless, tattered, barren our situation is, Jesus specializes in repairing broken lives. Jesus is a restorer and a sustainer of life. You may not know where your blessing is going to come. You may not know from who, but we can be sure that God will bless us. But I got to quickly move on to this third movement as we close. And this is a quick one because I know y'all thinking he's been preaching a long time already. But the third movement that is punctuated in this theme of redemption, we see it in verses 18 through 22. And it is the theme of a reigning Redeemer. A reigning Redeemer. Here it is. It says, now these are the generation of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. And Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. Now, y'all know when we come to genealogy in Scripture, we kind of just skip over those, don't we? We're like, man, those, first of all, I don't even know how to pronounce all those names. What do they have to do? But we need to know that this genealogy matters. Because of the new life that comes through the union of Boaz and Ruth coming together, this genealogy leads us to the King David. New life comes through this union. God redeems new life. And this lineage is significant because the reigning king would come through this union. King David would reign as redeemer. And here is the even better part, is that not only would King David reign as the redeemer through this union, but Jesus Christ, the King of kings and the Lord of lords, would come through this union as well. We have a redeeming, reigning king. I just got to put this in here. But y'all need to know that Ruth's mother-in-law, I know you know one of her mother-in-laws was Naomi. But when she gets married to Boaz, you know who her other mother-in-law is? Rahab, the prostitute. And look what God does through unusual circumstances. You think that your story has no more meaning and that it's over, but you have no idea what God is not only going to do through you, but through future generations to come down the line. Perhaps you'll be long and gone before you even know what God does through your lineage, and people will call your name while you're gone and said, I thank God for grandma such and such. I thank God for granddad such and such. I thank God for great-grandmama and great-granddaddy. Listen, God can use your name, use your story. I think about in my own family. My wife, she lost her father at the age of 5, Pastor Willie James Mason. And when Lady Key and I got married, one of the things that we said we were going to do is, some of you, I don't know if you know this, but my first name, Perrin, is my mother's maiden name. And so I decided, even before I decided to get married, that whoever I was going to marry, they need to have a good last name, because I was going to make sure that their maiden name was our son's first name. And so as God would have it, we had our first son. The first child that we had was a son. And his name is Mason because he is named after his grandfather. He has his grandfather's name. Not only that, but Mason has actually all 3 family names, Mason, Perrin, Rogers, and for generations, those names will be continued on. And then Jackson has my grandmother's maiden name, my grandmother's last name, and so he's carrying the name as well. And Grayson, he has James as his middle name, which is his grandfather's name, and Hudson, he has Henry as his middle name, which is a family name as well. Here it is that the lineage and the names matter, because they will carry on for generations and generations. Listen, I know I'm out of time, and I'm going to close with this. But I want someone to be encouraged, and I steal this illustration from my colleague and friend up in Chicago, Pastor Charlie Dates. He says, if you were to take a necktie, and you open this necktie up, and on that, before you open it up, you look at the outside, and you see how beautiful it is, how laid out it is. But if you were to open this up, you would see that there is thread and string tattered around in a fashion that does not look pleasing to the eye. But the thing is that we don't wear our ties inside out. We wear our ties outside in. And when we look at our life from the inside out, here is often what we see. Things are tattered in a way that does not make sense. But the master seamstress who put this tie together, even though it may look raggedy on the inside, when you look at it on the outside, it looks good. And that's what God is doing here with this story with Naomi. Is that she is looking at her life in chapter 1 as it is tattered and is making a mess and it is bitter. And I don't like how God has threaded the pieces of my life together. But if you would only flip that thing around, and if Naomi had a chance for us to see how we're reading her story now, she would say, God, look what you did in your hands as you masterfully wove all these things together of kindness and things of redemption and things of loyalty and things of noble character, because when you put it together in your hands, oh God, it's always a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece that works for our good and that brings you glory. Blessed be the God of Naomi. Blessed be the God of Ruth and Boaz. Blessed be the God that would come through their marriage. Jesus Christ, our Redeemer and our Savior.